Welcome everybody to our studies in AQA A-Level History, specifically Module 1F, which concerns industrialisation and the people. Generally speaking, we're going to be covering the period of British history from around 1783 all the way to 1885. And we're going to begin in this lesson by just looking at the social and political system of Great Britain in 1783. Now, this period of time was a political system that was shaped in Britain by the monarchy, but also with the fact that we are seeing the growing influence of parliamentary institutions and the complex dynamics that begin to take shape between various different political factions. Some of those things are what we're going to look at here. The specification requires you to understand the British political system in 1783, the idea of government and representation, the distinction and difference between local and national democracy, and the Whig and Tory parties, the two parties that were essentially shaping the complex dynamics between these political factions. So beginning first then, by 1783, we see that Great Britain had a constitutional monarchy with King George III at the helm. That's who is pictured here. Now, while the king had and held significant executive power during this time, especially when we think about things relating to foreign policy and military matters, his authority was increasingly constrained by the parliamentary system. For those of you who don't know, and you don't need to know this because this is prior to the period of study that you are looking at here, but ever since the period of the Stuart dynasty and the civil wars that took place there with the beheading of Charles I and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II and then James II and then ultimately with William of Orange, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, some 100 years prior to this period, we see that the monarchy is significantly curtailed by the sovereignty of Parliament. So the growth in the power of Parliament to pass laws and to have certain controls that were traditionally in the hands of the monarchy has been the case since around 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. The political power of the monarchy then had therefore diminished, but we still see that the king had wielded considerable influence, particularly when it comes to the appointment of ministers and also through the yielding of the royal prerogative. Parliament itself is what we called a bicameral legislature. It's still what we call a bicameral legislature. A legislature is an institution of government that passes laws, it passes legislation, so Parliament is a legislature, just like how in America, Congress is a legislature. And it is bicameral in nature. Bicameral just simply means two chambers. It is in two chambers. The two houses of Parliament were the House of Commons. At this time, the House of Commons was the lower house, and it was composed of members of Parliament elected by property-owning men in constituencies across Britain. The system of representation was far from democratic by the modern standards of democracy that we think of today, but the franchise, the people who had the right to vote, was restricted. Many constituencies, particularly in rural areas, also had outdated and unrepresentative boundaries, and this became known as a situation of, quote, rotten boroughs. So that's what the sort of system of democracy looked like in the House of Commons. The House of Lords was composed of hereditary peers. Hereditary peers were noblemen who inherited their titles. Essentially a little bit of British politics 101 for you. An MP, a member of Parliament, is somebody who sits in the House of Commons. A peer is somebody who sits in the House of Lords, or a lord as well. They could also just be called lord whoever. So that's the distinction, and it's a distinction that we still have to this day. At the time, the majority of, if not all of the members of the House of Lords were composed of hereditary peers, noblemen who inherited their titles, as well as bishops from the Church of England. Now, While the House of Lords could influence legislation, it was a revisory body for the most part, and we could see that this was a period of time in which the House of Commons was increasingly gaining more and more power and significance when it came to passing of legislation. And this was something that took place over a period of quite a long time. Prior to the Glorious Revolution, prior to the Stuart period, and even prior to an extent to the Tudor period, the House of Lords had quite a significant amount of power, despite the fact that when you go back previously to before the Stuart period, Parliament had very little power over the monarchy at all at that point. Now, the Prime Minister during this time was usually the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons and served as the head of government, even though the title itself was not officially recognised in 1783. So the position and the office of the Prime Minister would begin to develop and grow over time, and we will see this take place throughout this series of lessons. In 1783 specifically, it was William Pitt the Younger who was the Prime Minister, who was appointed at the age of 24 and was one of the youngest ever to hold the office. As I mentioned previously, the voting rights in and during this period were limited to men who owned land or property above a certain value. And what this meant was that the people who had the right to vote was a very small proportion of the population. Representation in Parliament was often very uneven. So many small towns, these rotten boroughs, sent MPs to Parliament despite having very few inhabitants, while the larger towns and cities with the greater populations would be sending the same number of MPs, despite the fact that those MPs represent a significant number of people. And so they were being underrepresented, whereas the people who were sending MPs from the rotten boroughs were overrepresented. This is a problem of representation in government and politics, where essentially the division of constituencies usually should take place on the basis of population, which is why various censuses will take place over many years, and then that will redraw boundary lines to make sure that you are representing roughly the same amount of people per member of parliament. At the national level, then, democracy was very limited, with a strong bias towards aristocracy and property owners. However, we do still see some democratic elements emerging by 1783. The first of these were, of course, the idea of parliamentary elections. Now, like I've said previously, while elections were held to Parliament, they were not particularly democratic, since political power was often concentrated in the hands of a small group of wealthy landowners and noble families. We see that elections were held in boroughs and counties, with boroughs being controlled by local elites and county elections being more competitive, but still nevertheless being heavily skewed in favour of the upper classes. At the local level, we see that local governance is dominated by the landed gentry. Local parish councils, sheriffs, and justices of the peace, JPs, were often landowners, and they often maintained order and had influence over the local economy. Now, local government had some democratic elements, but was far from equal or representative when it came to the entire population of that particular local constituency. If we were to contrast this then to modern parliamentary systems, the elected officials were chosen by relatively small and relatively elite segments of society. There was no idea of universal suffrage or secret ballot. In fact, the idea of universal suffrage long outdates this idea, or long postdates, shall I say, this idea of the period of history that we're studying here. We're going to finish by 1885. We don't get universal suffrage until the mid-1900s, so forget about thinking about universal suffrage during this course. While the foundation for a more representative democracy was still in place, it was nevertheless not fully utilized during this period in time, at least at the point at which we're beginning our studies. The two main political factions in Britain at this time were the Whigs and the Tories. These groups were not political parties in the modern sense that we know today, although they do later develop into political parties, or at least the Tories definitely develop into political parties later on. But they were just generally broad political movements or factions that represented different interests and different ideologies. Now, you might think, well, isn't that what a political party is? And broadly speaking, you would be correct that that is what a political party is. It's a group that generally represents a certain collection of ideological interests and ideological biases. However, the kind of structure and the kind of funding and the kind of infrastructure that is in place for the kind of political parties that we see today is very different to how it was at this point in history. So first of all, then, the Whigs were generally associated with liberal and progressive elements of society, advocating, for example, for parliamentary supremacy and the protection of civil liberties. They had historical association with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Glorious Revolution was where we invited back the monarch of William of Orange to rule in favour of James II, who was, of course, a Catholic. And ultimately, this was done with the precept that ultimately Parliament would have more power conferred onto them than that of the monarchy. So the Glorious Revolution of 1688 not only removed the threat of having a Catholic king, which of course was problematic and had been problematic since the break from Rome under Henry VIII, but ultimately also was significant for the fact that it created this idea of parliamentary supremacy or parliamentary sovereignty, the idea that Parliament has the supreme authority to make or unmake any law they so choose. This is a doctrine of constitutional law that we still uphold to and adhere to this day. So the Whigs had this historical association to the Glorious Revolution. And in 1783, the Whigs were more aligned with the commercial and urban elites, supporting the interests of trade, industry, and the growing middle class. They were typically in favour of things like reform, although their vision for reform was more gradual rather than specifically revolutionary. So they believed in a sense of incrementalism rather than revolutionary reform. William Pitt the Younger, although he was a member of the Tory faction, was nevertheless supported by some Whigs during his tenure as Prime Minister due to his leadership during the American Revolutionary War and his stance against French revolutionary influences, which we will get to in future lessons. By contrast, then, the Tories were the more conservative faction, and were traditionally aligned with the monarchy in addition to the Anglican Church. They generally supported the established social order and were generally cautious about reforms that could disrupt the traditional hierarchies within society. They were often associated with rural landowners and aristocrats. They were part of the aristocracy, as they were defenders of the interests of the landed classes, people who owned land essentially. They would be generally opposed to significant changes in the political system, and they were also supportive of strong royal authority, but were nevertheless wary of radical changes that we see occurring, for example, in France during the French Revolution and in the United States during the American Revolution. So finishing off then, what we see is that in 1783, the country was still dealing with a number of issues. One of these issues was, of course, the aftermath of the American Revolutionary War, and the political landscape was influenced by the events that had taken place in the American colonies. The Tory government, for example, under Lord North, had overseen Britain's failure to maintain control over the American colonies, which led to a political crisis. This political crisis led to the resignation of Lord North and the rise of William Pitt the Younger as new Prime Minister, who was tasked with essentially trying to rebuild a sense of national stability. The Whigs were divided on the issue of the American Revolution and other major policies of that matter as well. Because while some Whigs were quite supportive of the growing power of the colonies, others were more conservative and so started to align with the Tory position when it came to maintaining royal authority. All of these internal divisions within both factions contributed to shifting alliances and complex political dynamics of the time, and we'll get to that in future lessons' time. But to just sort of conclude this video then, we can see that in 1783, the point at which we're beginning this line of inquiry, we see that British political system was a blend of both monarchy and also the emerging and growing emergence of parliamentary democracy, characterized by a significant gap between the ideals of representation and the reality of elite control. The next lesson is going to think about the next part of the specification, specifically examining a number of different parts of William Pitt the Younger's position in government as Prime Minister, his relationship with the King, the 1784 election, reform and finance, as well as administration and trade. All of that will be part of the next lesson.